as you were talking about what has happened with Trump over the past couple of years and the reaction that the elite power class has had to him, and then when you were defining the two different types of existences or outlooks on life, there's the people who admit that there's a universal mandate, or not even a mandate, but like how people live. So that would be, people are fallen, they need a nation state, they need a form of governance so that we can have some type of organization so we can live within communities, and that's how they organize. And then there's the other side that is these elite ruling class. I guess the question here is, because we are so unique, because we have risen to a point in recorded history where you could argue we are the most powerful nation that has ever existed.
All right. Welcome back to another episode of Patriot on Purpose. Really excited about today. Have a good friend on, John Pigott. John would tell you that he is not an interesting person, but it is absolutely the opposite of that. So if he says that, just ignore him. But I met John back in, I think, 2017 through another business partner, a former business partner of mine. We got to work with John on a pretty fun crypto project that had us out in Washington, D.C. and in New York City quite a bit. So got to run around and travel some and do some business. And during that time period, got to learn a lot about John and the way that he sees the world. And he touches a lot of neat projects and is involved with a lot of very neat people, which gives him a very interesting perspective on the world, not to mention his own successes. John was the created and founded BondPoint, which was the first bonds exchange platform. So has a pretty serious string of successes in the FinTech world. He also started out as a public defender. Comes from a long line of people that have been involved in law, going back to his father, who was a judge. Side note, John is the only person that most of you out there will listen to that has actually been kidnapped by the Ku Klux Klan and lived to tell about it. I don't know if we'll get to that story, but that's one interesting tidbit about him. But he's also hit a more current project he's got. Abe, a Better Exchange, is a securities platform that they are building currently. I believe is that based out in Dubai?
Based in Austin, Texas.
Okay, it's based
God's
in
country.
Austin. Okay. Just I know you've been doing a lot out in Dubai. Again, international man of mystery we have here. So we're going to touch on a lot of topics.
Hold on.
Today, John, is there anything?
Dubai, do you have tigers when you're going out there? Do you get an escort of tigers?
I'll tell you a story about that. I mean, tigers are very real in Dubai. Not a native species, but they're
this
there.
This is my question
there.
then, because I know I'm going off on the weeds here, but there are more tigers in captivity in the state of Texas than there are tigers in the wild in the rest of the world. So what is your plan to get a tiger in Texas, since you're not headquartered in Dubai like I just thought you were?
Well, Minnie's married. I mean, Nate's wife has already found a partner in
captivity.
No, the story about Dubai, the first time I went over there for business a couple of years ago, I was supposed to meet this sheikh in front of this hotel. We're going to have lunch. And so I got there a little bit early. So I figured I'd stand outside and kind of greet him as he comes in. And about 10 minutes before he arrives, this, convertible Rolls Royce pulls up. And this guy he's the driver, he has the full robes on and everything. And he gets out of the car. I noticed sitting in the passenger seat up front next to him is this cheetah, live cheetah. And the guy in front of the door, like very casually, one of them opens up the door for the driver, another one opens up the door for the cheetah, very casually takes the reins of the cheetah, leads him about 50 feet down, and parks him in these prearranged cheetah cages, basically. And the guy comes back, and I'm like, something tells me you've seen that before. Is that insane? He's like, well, a lot of the guys, they like the cats, so yeah, it's pretty. We have a couple of them, about a half dozen every day for lunch. Want to park their cheetah. And he informed me, he's like, well, now what they all learned the hard way over the last 5 years is there's a difference between a prey stalking cat, like a tiger, and a pursuing predator cat. A prey stalking cat, You do not want them in the front seat of the car next to you because they're just staring at you, waiting for their turn. But a chasing cat is always looking out the window ahead to look something to chase. So you're safe in that car. But we had a couple of shakes mauled by the first category. We don't do that anymore. So now it's just strictly cheetahs. Like, this is the craziest place on the planet. Like, you've got this all worked out. Like, my God, they can normalize anything.
A pursuing cat.
They've got that.
Yeah, what are you into? Pursuing cats or prey cats? Prey chasing cat. All right, I've got just the thing for you.
That's awesome. All right, so before we get into any more stories or onto the topic of talking about America and is it the next Rome? One of the things that we ask every guest, John, and you probably noticed the name Patriot on purpose. Patriot's become a little bit of a bad word, especially if you're in Washington D.C. and depending on where else you are. It's got negative connotation around it. So we're just wanting to make sure that we continue to bring people back to like what a patriot is. So we'd love to know from your perspective, like what is your definition of a patriot?
Well, it's interesting on that. I think you have to start with some fundamental questions, and you have to kind of work your way up to the syllogism tree to find out where people diverge in their thinking about the world. And fundamentally, I think the fundamental two worldviews are you either believe that human nature is universal and unchanging through history, or you believe that there can at times be a small group of super smart, super virtuous people, and therefore, since they have all the knowledge and they have all the virtue, then it's only logical that they have all the power, and therefore, in their worldview, it's very logical on it. If you take the first one, it's somewhat of the tragic versus romantic worldviews too. So if you start with the premise that human nature is capable of amazing things but inherently flawed, and that we're all the same, and that we're all the same people that we were 3,000 years ago, then you can learn from history and learn that certain institutions are very useful for creating thriving communities, and one of those is the nation state. And then it becomes very logical that, well, if that's a positive, civilizing institution, then the citizens of that nation state should be able to control who's a member. Like, it's necessary for the national security. So that's pretty obvious. Now, if you start with, we have this small people of 100,000 people in the world who are enlightened, and therefore we should be able to redraw national boundaries and everything else, then their position is within their framework. Their position is kind of logical, is sort of logical. So there is very clearly a force now at breaking down institutions. They think it is a virtuous thing to break down these institutions of society, including family, gender identity, the state, school system, businesses, capitalism, the nation state, everything else. And they are authentically, sincerely convinced if they do all that, it will lead to a new and better place for mankind. They really believe it. And that's a line of thought that's been developing out for about 100 years, really 200 if you start with Hegel. But they're very authentic about it. They're very serious about their beliefs. And it's coming to a head. Now we see two worldviews kind of in stark contrast. And obviously, I'm of the belief that, humans are amazing and wonderful creatures, but we do start with inherent internal flaws, and we need some institutions to, civilize us. And that the nation state is one of those really helpful institutions. If you look back through human history, and if you accept that our human nature is the same 2,000 years ago as it was today, and it's the same at Botswana and Bulgaria and Bolivia as it is in Austin, Texas, then we can learn from those. If you think your human nature is different, then history is irrelevant. You don't learn from history because that's just stuff that the stupid people did, the stuff that the lower primates did, and that's the idiot. And I think that's where it parts. Yeah, so I think this is very good institution for keeping physical safety and creating structure, which allows humanity to thrive and build things and improve life. And sorry for the long-winded rant, but I mean, I really think you have to crawl all the way up the syllogism to see where we part to begin with, because it's sort of useless arguing about, I want more immigration. No, I want less immigration. Like, what even is that? you know. But we've reached a threshold here where people are finally having to confront the reality of this clash of worldviews, and we're going to have to make a choice.
So in your definition of a patriot, would that be somebody who is, I wouldn't even say loyal, but who ascribes to the first type of belief system that human nature is more or less immutable, the nation state is a good thing, and that the nation state that came out of the war with Britain back in the 18th century, so through the Declaration of Independence and now forming a more perfect union in the United States, would be a patriot is somebody who does and expresses loyalty to this new nation state being the United States, and ultimately saying, like, we should be governed by noble people and not necessarily people who have the belief that they are superior to the lesser peons or to the serf class, and more to, hey, like, we're all in this together, so let's commit to this one experiment, this grand experiment of democracy, or actually not democracy, but don't need to go there. So yeah, I'm trying to.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And if you go back and read our founding documents, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Articles of Things, Confederation, all of those are an expression of this worldview that human nature is universal and immutable through history. And therefore, it makes no sense to have a royal class. It makes no sense to have a royal king. There is no bloodline difference. You don't have good genetics that makes you a virtuous person or omniscient. So if that's the case, and if we're all co-equal, then that has massive implications about it. In a lot of ways, it looks like we are refighting the Civil War of the English Civil War of the 1600s, where you had the royalists who support kind of the insider class and well-educated class and good bloodlines that supported a king. And then you had on the other side the roundheads, they call them, which was the blue-collar and then also the merchant class. And they were saying, look, we reject your idea of royal bloodlines. Like, we just totally reject it. And I think that's, through American history, like, we've repeated that kind of clash. And maybe that's the essential class of all civilizations. I don't know. But we're definitely in that mode now. And it really goes to the fundamental question of, what do you think human nature is? Now, if you believe that there is there's a concept of a human soul, or whether there's some kind of essential human quality that is special in the world and of limitless economic value, then the U.S. constitutional structure makes a lot of sense. So we had, the America's success is, I think we have amazing hardware. Our geography is unbelievable, but we had really good software too in this expression of values. And we've messed them up so many times, but we keep getting called back. So, Martin Luther King Jr. brought us back and said, you say all men are created equal, but look around you. Mm-hmm. You're lying.
Right.
And the rest of America eventually said, crap, he's right. He's just like, we can't deny that. He's right. So there are many times through American history that we're called back to these fundamental ideas that human nature is universal and every human being deserves equal respect. And we don't like royal classes, man. We don't really like them at all.
One bit. I'm not going to bow before the king.
Yeah, I'm not impressed by King Charles. Like, kind of looks like a putz, frankly. Like, not impressed, not impressive. But I think that's what we see. Like, it was really interesting to me to see the deep visceral reaction to the twin prosecutions of Donald Trump in New York and then of Hunter Biden. And, as a lawyer, I can go through all the procedural issues. They violated this, they didn't do that, right? But what's more interesting and way more powerful is this visceral reaction for every American, for most Americans, I think, who look at it and say, that could happen to me. That could happen to my son. Or it already did happen to my son. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to live in that world. I just don't want to live in it. And that's very hopeful to me, because the American conscience, I think, has been aroused. And, when we confront reality, we do great. It's when we, allow delusion to saturate us that we get into weird trouble.
So I want to talk more about...
Getting really deep here, guys.
No, I love it. No, I want to... This is exactly what I want to talk about. I definitely want to talk about more about confronting reality. But it's interesting. The Trump thing is such a really good topic because I think it represents it's a very real, tangible example of what's going on right now and how polarized everything is. So it's like we've got half of the population that's watching. Or at least I'm hopeful that it's at least half. I'd love for it to be more. But is watching this and going like, wow, that's really really scary. What's going on?
I really do.
Yeah, So, but what is it about? Like, what? How did we get to the place to where there's still too many people, and whether you like Trump or not, like I really don't feel like that's even the topic because there's a lot of people that I don't like, but I also can make the distinction between like I don't like that person, but I also do think that they are good at the thing that they've been put in place to do. They're good at their job or they're good at this particular this function, but why are people getting so, I guess, why are they so against Trump? And like, why are they willing to allow, like, it doesn't bother them that our legal system is essentially unraveling and being weaponized. I mean, how did we, what are your thoughts on that? And how did we get there?
There's so much going on there, and I wouldn't pretend to be able to unravel all of it. I think there's something very viscerally happening very deeply with the American left and frankly with kind of the American power class, if you will. And I lived in New York City, Upper West Side, for about 12 years, and all of my neighbors think this guy is literally Hitler. He's literally Hitler on it. There are all kind of things playing out. Like one of the things I think that's very powerful but unspoken about is he's perceived, especially among the New York City kind of media power class, as a class betrayer. So they think of themselves as having this inside game. Everybody's working together to keep the stupid people away from what's really going on. And then Trump comes in, and he's like, I'm worth $1 billion. I know all you people. I rent you when I need you, and you're worthless, and you're parasites. Well, nobody likes to hear that they're parasites. Like, that's just, that hurts, man. And so he challenged their actual identity, and they are defending it basically to the death. There's a really interesting segment of that last debate that he had with Hillary Clinton, and they asked him about a question, and he says, "Why do you think, Mr. Trump? Why do you think that, that the American system is corrupt?" And he's like, "I know they're corrupt because I use them. I mean, I had Hillary Clinton attend my fiance, when Melania was my fiance, playing the band. She said, and she's, Hillary Clinton's standing 10 feet away. He's like, she said she wanted Hillary Clinton at our wedding, so yeah, throw him $150,000. She shows up at our wedding. That's how I know it's corrupt, because I use it." Like, holy cow! Like that is really personal and really powerful. It's also true, but that hurts. And so their entire world view of this little empowered class is really being threatened, and they know it. And so from some perspective, they're acting logically. Now, as a former lawyer, this is completely outrageous because they've thrown out all objective adherence to objective principles, which is what they've preached to us for 200 years.
So what specifically, like what are some of the specific things that you could point out?
Yeah, so politically motivated prosecutions, period. Suppressing evidence, keeping vital evidence out of a trial. Frankly, going back to Alvin Bragg's original campaign when he ran for district attorney of Manhattan to say, and his campaign was, "I'm going to indict Trump." So he never mentioned a crime. He said, "I'm going to get him." Well, usually you mention the crime first when you're in criminal prosecution business. Like, that's kind of the concept here. So we've obliterated this concept of there is an objective system that we all work our way through. And that's been really vital towards keeping peace in America for a long, long time. I tell you what I think I've always looked at as maybe the high point of American civilization, right? In about 1977 or so, the Klan, there was a community outside Chicago called Skokie, Illinois, and it was populated, one neighborhood in particular, by Jewish survivors of the Nazi death camps. And they'd all settled together, and they had a community together. The Ku Klux Klan filed a parade petition so that they could have a Klan march right through the middle of that neighborhood. And of course, everybody gets outraged. And I'll never forget on TV, I was a young kid. I'm not that old. I was a very young kid. But I'll never forget on NBC News that night, one of the guys in the neighborhood who showed the tattoos from Auschwitz on his arm stepped up to the camera and said, "Let them march." We didn't survive that, so we could simply reinstitute fascism in America. As long as they're not violent, they can say anything they want, period.
Wow.
And that's an objective principle. It's more, yes, there will be massive emotional pain caused by this, no question. But it's more important that we adhere to this national unifying objective principle that on the First Amendment, you should be able to express yourself, you should be able to assemble and spend time anywhere that is safe, and as long as you're not advocating or committing violence, that's it. Like, let them speak. And the ACLU, to their credit, stepped up and defended the Nazi paraders. And it almost destroyed the ACLU, but they stood on principle and defended it. And that's what I think of when I think of the constitutional rights legacy of the U.S., that this gentleman who had survived arguably some of the worst treatment in human history, just completely inhumane, but he had come to this country because we said we were all about these principles, and he was willing to pay the personal price of emotional pain, massive emotional pain, so that he could be sure and reaffirm that he lived in a country that allowed people to speak their minds anytime they wanted to. Well, that doesn't get any better than that, I mean, to me. And we're a long way away from that.
Yeah,
we're a long way away from that.
Do you think it takes having gone through something as extreme as what that individual had gone through to be able to stand there like that and be able to see that situation in that way, to where, like, no, we have to protect this. Like, and so do you think do you think we're so far removed from that type of emotional pain, like, experienced by the masses? Just, I guess, that was then, this is now. Like, what, I mean, what's the difference between now and then, and why? Because it seems like there's part of, like, the reaction to Trump, and people like Trump isn't just the, him trying to drain the swamp. Like, it feels like the masses are kicking back because they don't like the emotional side of things that he brings out of people. Like, I don't know if that's an accurate way to articulate.
And I get some of that, by the way. Like, I agree with him some of that.
Sure.
So there's a lot of things I wish he would, like, kind of roll that dial down a little bit, pal. Like, maybe not the language or anything like that. And I get that. But I think, to me, it's worth the trade-off, because what we're dealing with here, I mean, to me, it's about, what is the big issue? And to me, the issue for the last 20 years has not been Republican versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative, or anything like that. The issue is, are we going to have an entitled class that has absolute power and can violate the law anytime they want? Or are we going to get back to the state where we have, at least verbally, publicly, a commitment to some type of objective rule of law? We know what path that leads down. And I wish, when you talk about honoring immigrants, I wish we would listen more to the immigrants from systems like Communist China or North Korea,
Cuba,
who've experienced this, or Cuba. And they're very clear. Like, they're very clear about recognizing the signs and ringing the warning bell of it. And I think we should just listen to them. One of the things about the U.S. that's so amazing, like I said earlier, we have such amazing hardware. And by that, I mean, like, Kaiser Wilhelm once, Bismarck, actually, I think, described the United States as a country surrounded on two sides by friendly and weak neighbors, and on the other two sides by fish, right? So we're the only country on the planet, basically, that really feels absolute physical security. I mean, the odds of us actually being invaded, like what, Canada, like Mexico, like, we're good. And so during the Cold War, we had this pressure, we had a real pressure of, they can commit violence against our community, our kids, and ourselves. And so that kind of was a balancing effect to keep us grounded to reality. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, we have no physical challenge to American military power on the planet. We certainly don't have a 1/1000% of any type of traditional military pressure in the U.S. So we've gotten kind of spoiled, and we've gotten kind of lazy in our thinking, and we've forgotten these things of cause and effect. Like when somebody commits a crime, you need to arrest them and put them in a box for a couple of years. Like that's just the way it works. And I'm sorry, that's an unfortunate part of human nature. Wish it didn't exist, but that's very important. Or you need to guard your borders, or you need to take care of your economy, so be sure that you're strong on it. So we got kind of spoiled here, and we can get kind of lazy in our thinking. And so it shouldn't be maybe a giant surprise that we've just imagined a world in which there is no real military conflict, because to us, there really isn't. You know, we're just pretty safe over here on our side of the Atlantic, our side of the Pacific. And if they want to come up from Nueva Laredo, like there's 100 guys here in Austin that could take care of all of them. They're well armed. There's not going to be a threat, no problem. You don't even call the military. Just call the guys in my neighborhood. They can take care of that.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things about being American, we lose track of, we live in just this amazing geographical place. Like in all the world, 38% of all the farmable land in the world is in the continental United States.
Okay.
52% of all the navigable waterways on the planet Earth are in the continental United States. So we got to, step back. And one of the things that's hit me through all my travels and stuff, I've been over 100 countries and really spent time in a lot of them, is that if you go to Africa, their average topsoil for the continent of Africa is about 4 inches deep. Well, if you go to the Mississippi Delta, it's 28 feet deep. So we've got massive farmland potential. Plus in Africa, there's a massive waterfall right within 5 miles of where every major river joins the sea. So you can't ship things up or down that river. Look at Russia. All their rivers flow in the wrong direction. They flow north to the Arctic Circle, means they're frozen in half the year. Only in the U.S. we have this massive farmland potential. We have this incredible river system, which allows us to basically, if we wanted to, we could turn off the rest of the world and we would be just fine. And we get really spoiled by that. But and that's the real power behind the U.S. economy. It's like you just can't, geography in a lot of ways is destiny. And we've got amazing geography.
That's part of the reason that the ruling class has felt so emboldened to attack Trump, as well as like Patriots. So as you were talking about what has happened with Trump over the past couple years and the reaction that the elite power class has had to him, and then when you were defining the two different types of existences or outlooks on life, there's the people who admit that there's a universal mandate, or not even a mandate, but like how people live. So that would be, people are fallen, they need a nation state, they need a form of governance so that we can have some type of organization so we can live within communities, and that's how they organize. And then there's the other side that is these elite ruling class. I guess the question here is, because we are so unique, because we have risen to a point in recorded history where you could argue we are the most powerful nation that has ever existed and probably will ever exist. I mean, just given the geography, the way that you laid it out, that's probably what led to them feeling like, hey, we can do this. We can go to war against our own people, because collectively, and I'm not in this whole, let's tax the rich, we hate the rich, but you just look at the most powerful people in the United States when it comes to the collection of wealth, and 100 families have more than, I don't even know the number, like 150 million Americans. Yep. So they're just like, we feel entitled to doing this because of the unique position that we have in this nation, in this time in history, and in the world too.
Yeah, and so let's unpack that for a second, right? So I think, first of all, in terms of the rich paying their fair share, I mean, the U.S., the top 1% earners pay 48.6% of all taxes. The top 4.5% pays 76% of all taxes. And the top 22.8% pays 98% of all taxes. So if people are arguing for a progressive tax system, well, we have a progressive tax system. Like, that's who pays the taxes. The only element of potentially the way you can get to unfairness, or the concept of unfairness, again, you have to crawl back up the tree of the syllogism to say, okay, before the unfairness about economic distribution is kind of down the syllogistic tree. If you crawl back up, you have to start with the question of how do we think economic value is created? Like, how is it created? And we've been through kind of three different worldviews through human history. For most of human history, we thought it came from the earth, like through mining and through farming was really the only way to create economic value. So we fought wars over turf because that's where over ground control, because that's where economic value came from. You start in the 1880s, or really the 1800s, really, where the Industrial Revolution, and all of a sudden some really bright economists looked at it, and they were bright. And Karl Marx was very bright, and he had, based on the information he had at the time, I think he had a great analysis on it. He just didn't have complete information. So he looked and said, hey, there are these guys walking into a factory every day. They don't get paid much. So the source of creation of economic value, it comes from labor. It comes from these guys working. They should get a bigger piece of the pie. So we spent 100, 200 years almost now with a large part of people thinking that economic value is created by labor. And then there are still a group of thinkers who say economic value comes out of the ground. And where you recognize that is every 15 years or so, since 1800, we've had a panic over running out of some type of natural element that fuels. And it's like, hey, if we're running out of coal and coal powers the economy, it's going to be a collapse. So it started in 1828 with a panic over we're running out of whales. We're using whale oil to light up the factories so people can work at night. We're running out of whale oil. The economy is going to collapse. So they found surface petroleum in Pennsylvania. And then about 20 years later, they started panicking because they were running out of surface oil. And then somebody innovated and found out, we can dig a hole and this thing comes, a lot of it down there. They started drilling for oil, and this whole series of economic panics. Now, the one, when I was a kid in the 70s, it was the global economy is based on telecommunications, which is a little bit of variation on economic value comes out of the ground. And since we use copper in electronic communications, and there's only so much copper, and we're running out of copper, and so the whole global economy is going to collapse. And so people invented fiber optic cable, and there's a lot of sand in the world that we can build fiber optic out of. And we see this over and over again. And you eventually have to revisit the ideas about where does economic value come from. Because it's clearly not from the ground, and it's clearly not for labor. And then the issue is like, where does it come from? How can a guy I know, Travis, get together with 8 guys, and 8 of them working for a year put code together and build Uber, build a $10 billion company? Well, it's not from labor. It's not because they worked weekends. And it's not from the ground. They didn't pull anything out of the ground. And you eventually arrive, or at least I have, that the real source of economic value in the world is human innovation. And that's a supply that's unlimited. And if you start with, we're going to run out of food because our farms can't produce more food, so there's, we need fewer people on the planet. That's the solution from the Treaty of Rome in 1972, or the Committee of Rome, that we need fewer people. This population's out of control. Well, if you start there, you end up with some pretty dark places. Like they literally said we need 2 billion fewer people, or else we're all going to starve. But if you believe that human innovation, or that economic value comes from human innovation, well, more humans, more innovation, more economic value. So you end up in a very different place. And we're looking at it for a digital economy, like they're not pulling things out of the ground. They're not exploiting labor. The labor is well paid. And so you really you're left with only one conclusion, which is economic value comes from human innovation, period, full stop. It probably always has. It's certainly going on the future. That's where it comes from. And that ends up in a very different place. All kind of downstream implications of that.
So how does that factor into what the power class or the ruling elite want to do with not only people in America, but people globally? If you look at the World Economic Forum and you look at the people who are collecting at Davos, and what they're saying is, effectively what they're saying is we need to cull the human population so that we can manage it better. Of course, they've got this scapegoat of climate change, which is probably effectively the same kind of thing that you're talking about. Hey, we're running out of copper. Hey, we're running out of this. Now we're running out of safe living conditions. And so, of course, like their thing is like, let's ratchet down on population. Let's ratchet down on the ability for people to own and propagate and be able to reproduce responsibly and all of this kind of stuff. So how does that factor into their plan with, I guess it flies in the face of what you're saying where it's innovation. Is this just, again, like, hey, if we have less people to contend with, we have an easier job of managing our, like, the class we rule over?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. I mean, when you start with the sense that economic value comes out of the ground or economic value comes out of labor, well, both of those are finite resources. And so it becomes, okay, let's carve up the pie differently, whatever else. But when you get to, so it's a zero-sum game, right? But when you get to a realization that economic value comes from human innovation, okay, that's limitless. There is no limit to that. So the panics when I was a kid was about global cooling, and the prediction of Paul Ehrlich and John Barnard in 1973 was that by 1984, 20 million Americans a year would be starving to death because population is going up. We only can produce a certain amount of food, so we're going to have and the world is cooling, so we're going to be starving to death. And their prediction was by 1984, 1985, about 20 to 22 million Americans a year would be starving to death. Well, I lived through that, and I was in 1984, and everybody was pretty well fed, I can tell you. So instead of revisiting, so these panics go on. And by the way, when they came up with that formula in 1973, the population of the world was about 3.4 billion people, and 90% of people lived under the poverty line. Now, the United Nations for 75 years has set up a poverty line. So by poverty, the current definition is a household that makes less than $4.12 a day. All right? So it's a family of four living on $4.12 a day. And when I was born and when that prediction was made, 90% of the people on the planet lived below that poverty line. And that was not unusual. That was the story of all human civilization. Almost all human civilization, the whole history was 90% of people on the planet were trying to figure out where they could get food the next day. It's literally that intense. Fast forward to today, just the span of my lifetime. Today, 90% of people live above that poverty line. Since the year 1990, every single day since January 1st, 1990, 100,000 people in the world have crossed over that line, out of poverty into some level of a better economic and a better quality of life. Holy cow, we literally fixed at least 90% of poverty. Nobody ever celebrates that. That's an insane accomplishment. And we didn't do it by constricting supplies of labor or constricting access to the ground. We did it by allowing human innovation to flourish. And that's the software part. It was not anticipated, I don't think, but that's where the original American kind of software, if you will, our founding principles, have proven to be an incredible set of beliefs to encourage human innovation. And we're living it.
Do you so you've mentioned human innovation a number of times, and we've mentioned panic. Do you believe it would be true to say on some level that panic is being manufactured in order to accelerate human innovation? Like, is panic being weaponized, like, intentionally?
I don't think it's being weaponized to encourage human innovation. I don't think they're that bright, honestly. I've been to Davos, I've been to a couple of the meetings, and to be honest with you guys, it's a room full of some of the most mediocre people I've ever spent time with in my life. I mean, if they're the community to destroy the world, we're all incredibly safe. Trust me, we're fine. Like these people can't bake a loaf of bread if they all work together. Like we're fine. What it is a residual, it's a residue, it's an echo of the system in the West that was basically set up post-World War II, where we had credentialing. So you get a medical degree, you'll be well paid for your entire career because you've got letters after your name, MD, and you're an official validator of what is true. If you're a lawyer or a CPA or an EBA, or if you got one of the go to an Ivy League institutions, there's a class membership ticket that if you get it, you're set, you're done, the world will be your oyster, everything's fine. That's the system that's falling apart. And not by accident, they are struggling and fighting for it because they know that this is a challenge to their entire system. And so they're fighting very hard to defend it.
How's it falling apart? Like in what ways?
Oh, like all around us, the redefinition of who actually delivers medical services, OTs, PTs, RNs. I mean, it's just all the way up and down the ladder. Who delivers legal services? Who decides, who is the validator of truth? Look at our media institutions. We used to have Tom Brokaw and Walter Cronkite. Now we have a few more than 3 people telling us what's reality. So those institutions are the delivery of information. Those institutions are completely falling apart. Washington Post lost 78 million yet last year. The New York Times is losing money. All these great institutions that had essentially a monopoly or more accurately an oligopoly on their little turf, all of that is falling apart on it. And it's not falling apart because people are pushing it back. It's because people have found alternative ways to get educated. We can expect over the next 10, 20 years for the whole university system and the degree program to be completely reinvented, largely through some of the stuff you guys are doing, which is delivering this information directly to people. So you don't need to sit in a college class and go into debt for $30,000 a year just to find out what are the basic values of built the United States. Should we keep them? Should we change them? Like, that's been a single monologue lecturing from people with PhDs and other letters after their name for 60 years. That's completely falling apart now. So you no longer need letters after your name or some kind of official imprimatur of approval to be able to distribute information, to have conversations. That's huge. The ability for the internet to I think look at the state of the old traditional department stores. Do they even exist anymore?
Barely.
Who does that? Does anybody go to Macy's or Sears and Roebuck? I don't think they even exist anymore. Kmart's gone. Yeah, it's all gone. So we've redefined all these these institutions have been redefined and substituted. And I'm crazy excited about it. I think there's because that creates a much more dynamic feedback loop. Because if somebody's not serving their customers well, they get replaced much more quickly. It's really, when you have 3 news networks or 4, they can all kind of hire from the same little group of people. They all think the same way. They all interpret the news the same way. When you have Joe Rogan and 200,000 podcasters delivering information, there's no way you can control that. It's just going to be much more dynamic. So it's all good.
That was actually when we were talking, Nate and I, yesterday about the topic that we were going to talk about, which was the fall of Rome. I'm almost seeing that us being Rome, clearly, and you look through time immemorial, most empires last for about 250 years. We're coming up on our 250th year anniversary pretty soon. The thing that I hear you saying is that there's actually a reason for hope, and to my mind, that almost means hey, maybe it's not the fall of America the way that we would predict if we were just a casual observer of history and saying, this is what happens to empires, go ahead and accept it, chalk it up for the American Empire having lasted for 250 years. They're like the British Empire, they're like the Spanish Empire, dustbin of history. It's almost like we're just reinventing this empire. And of course, we are moving towards a more global economy. I mean, globalization is absolutely a thing, but I don't think that we're ever going to become... There's no amalgamation between the United States and what's happening in Indochina because, again, the seas and the fishes, they're in between us, so it's just not going to happen. But I can kind of see this awakening that we had already talked about, the reaction that people had to the Trump convictions, 34 felonies. Oh, yeah, I'm sure. But people are they're waking up to it, and I see that this is actually could be a catalyst for the reinvention of America, as opposed to the eventual demise.
Yeah.
I mean, tell me if that's kind of what you're hitting on here, because it sounds like it.
No, totally. I think we're finally being confronted with this reality of the two schools of thought and what the struggle is, and we have to choose between them. And there's a great book by George Friedman several years ago called "The Accidental Empire" about the United States. And George used to be head of research at the CIA for about 20 years. He's done amazing work. He used to run Stratfor and stuff. And he does these long views of history on it. And his whole thesis is that, look, the American people never wanted to be empire. We didn't want to be the empire, the Roman Empire. There's zero support for that. Republican, Democrat, whatever decade, nothing is more popular, if you poll people, than let's stop bothering other countries and bring all the troops home and leave everybody alone. Like, that's literally popular with like 98% of people. Like, just stop screwing with the world. We don't need them. We don't care with them. We're not doing any good. It doesn't look like we're doing any good. Leave them alone.
That kind of goes to your point around how human economic value was contrived or derived. It used to be the land. So colonialism was a big thing because, like, if you wanted to have and produce value, you needed to own more land. The school of thought where it's human innovation, it's like, hey, let's just focus on America first and our best and our brightest, and we'll be able to deliver value for ourselves and others, which is why we wouldn't have had to be an empire, because we're just here doing our thing.
No, right. No, so the question is, what do you do with it? So there are kind of two worldviews playing out in the U.S. right now, and the one that was stated most explicitly, right, and I remember when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and a few weeks after Muammar Gaddafi, the ruler of Libya, had been basically assassinated by U.S. forces, she was speaking at a European conference, and somebody asked her in the Q&A, would you comment on the death of Colonel Gaddafi? And I was floored at her response. She said, well, we came, we saw, he's dead. And then she laughed. Well, that's a specific reference to Julius Caesar saying, Veni, Vidi, Vici. We came, we saw, we conquered. And so that's the stark contrast of worldviews. Is America going to see itself as a global military empire getting anything it wants from other countries at the point of a gun, disrespecting and violating all rules of law, fairness, or tradition, disrespecting other countries' values, even their sovereignty itself, and just grab a hold of whatever else we want? We have the military power to do that, by the way. Like, we actually could. If we actually wanted to do that, we could actually run this planet as a military empire, period. Or do we want to choose a different path? Now, the question is about choosing a different path, and it's a legitimate question, is, okay, who steps into the power vacuum? That's a totally legitimate conversation to have. And I'm not saying if we pulled back all our troops from overseas, everything would be fine the next morning. But I would obviously prefer for us to go to some type of multilateralism where each country has full respect of each other country's system and rights in it. And that point was more recently brought home, at least to other countries, and they were put on alert when in the seizure of Russian sovereign wealth funds. So Russia invades Ukraine. That war, I don't really have a feeling on it. Coin flip. I've been through. I rode a motorcycle to Ukraine. They were nice to me. They fed me. I don't know. Other than that, I don't know anything about Ukraine. But a couple of weeks after that, the European and U.S. banking regulators got together, and they seized $418 billion of Russian sovereign wealth funds. Well, that's about $5,000 for every Russian family. I mean, that's real money. And they just seized it. Now, they said they were suspending it because, it was very complicated treaties and everything, and we'll give it back to them when the war is over. Well, 3 weeks of predictably, there's a bill in Congress now that, well, maybe we should just take that money. Okay, that's the act of someone, with the facade of a legal system with civil rights, but in reality, they're just using military power to take whatever money they want from anybody. Okay, that is incredibly destabilizing. And what you've encouraged in doing that in February, or actually in April of 2022, you actually encourage the BRICS nations and all the other countries of the world to create their own new payment system that is completely outside of the SWIFT payment networks, for example, or the securities exchanges of European and the U.S. So we're actually incentivizing them to build their own system, which we will have not only no control over, we'll have no influence over whatsoever. So the whole thing is backfired, and it's a big mess. But if we end up with something that looks like multilateralism, that could be really beneficial, because maintaining the U.S. military empire is a commitment to constant war all over the planet, 2 to 3 active wars at any given time, forever.
Well, and once you start that, can you? I mean, once you've started that train has left the station. I mean, that's what we've basically been doing. I mean, can you walk that back? I mean, because the thing that after we were over there for so long and we've activated, so many we've killed so many terrorists, but also in doing so, we've also created exponentially more terrorists. I mean, can we extract ourselves from those places in the world and not expect them to now come here?
Well, if we wanted to, we could control who comes here.
You're right. If we wanted to,
we got big lakes on both sides of us.
Yeah.
Right, and that's not complicated. If we wanted to, but again, if we wanted to, but if you start with the premise that the United States and Western civilization in general is the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity, which is part of the left's concept, then these are things that should be torn down ab initio. They should be fundamentally just destroyed on it and just start all over. And I mean, obviously not everybody voting against Donald Trump thinks that. But at the core of their ideology, it's a rejection, not simply of like the state of Israel or the United States, but it's a rejection of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the whole concept that man can be a rational thinking individual. And eventually it reverts to, as Tom Wolfe noted, we're back to tribalism. His last novel was Back to Blood. And his whole point was like, if you dissolve these institutions, all we're left with is our genetic, gender, and ethnic identity, and we tend to want to kill each other.
Well, I mean, there's
that.
I mean, we're one hurricane away, like given any given city to watch that happen. Just look back at what happened at Katrina.
Yeah. I mean, that's the part of the everything's a trade-offs. There are negative consequences to America being so geographically protected. And one of them is, if you look at a community as the United States, it's kind of hard to look at it. But if you look at a community as an old German village 1,000 years ago, where you have a wall around the perimeter of the village, and every once in a while, the guys from the next town over try to get over that wall and steal your stuff. Well, if you live in that type of balanced, feedback loop of reality right there in your face, then there's an appreciation for, frankly, the masculine values, because the usefulness of men is when the hordes come over the wall, the men go out and kill them, all right? I mean, there's a usefulness to this thing.
Right.
And so men understand that you need that balance of the feminine and masculine nature. Both of them have their roles. If you're sitting in a country where there really is no, really cognizable, formal military threat externally, then eventually start to question, like, what are these men, what are they doing? Like, they're kind of wasting space here. Like, we don't have really usefulness for them. And so, and the other thing, one of my favorite writers, Camille Paglia, turned her Yale dissertation into an amazing book called The Sexual Persona. And she traced the whole history. It's like a 4,000-page book. It's a honker. But she traced the whole 3,000-year history in Western civilization of the concept of gender and sexuality. And she identified that it is very one of the consistent, whether China, Africa, Europe, one of the things that crops up in the last stage before an empire collapses is gender and sexual speciation. It becomes like a Cambrian explosion. There's call it confusion, call it blurring lines, or whatever else. Now, is that part of what we're seeing in the U.S.? I don't know. But she notes that this was 20, 30 years ago when she wrote the book, she noted, and she is a lesbian that identifies as a transgender person. She doesn't have anything against the LGBT community. She just recognized that just throughout history, this type of blurring of sexual roles and partners and everything else it always happens at the end of the collapse stage, right before the collapse of empires. So we've got to make a decision pretty quickly. The time may be pretty short for us to do it. And I think we will. I think we are, and I think we'll. I don't know. I'm always betting on the US,
author
man.
that
So
Joe
what do you-
Rogan references when he talks about that specific thing that happens at the end of an empire? Because I've heard him say that before, but I just didn't recognize the name. You say Camille Paglia?
Yeah, Camille's one of the most amazing intellects and she's very much a person of the left, like very much a person. She identifies as socialist, all right, and she is disgusted at what's happening to Donald Trump right now.
Really?
Like, she's taught art and art history for all of her career, 40 years, and she just finds it as repugnant as the most right-wing wacko on the most right-wing site. Like, she's straight up like, this is anti-civilization. This is literally a purposeful bringing about of a collapse of one of the most amazing civilizations. They're literally trying to destroy it. Like, that's how far she goes harder about it than I do. But she's a lot smarter than I am, though.
What's her theory around?
90% of the time when I have a different opinion and I hear Camille say something, I'm like, 90% of the time, my operating bias is like, well, I'm wrong, she's right. Like, she's just right. Yeah. She's such a good thinker.
So what's her
things.
operating theory about why they're trying to do this to Trump and trying to destabilize the nation, if you happen to know?
Oh, yeah. I mean, she goes back and she traces it, and this is something I took the deep dive on several years ago. It goes back to kind of the core fundamental, the philosopher kings of whole leftism in the world. And one of the main ones of that is Antonio Gramsci, who wrote in the late 1920s. He was imprisoned by Mussolini in an Italian prison for being a communist. One of the very positive things that Mr. Mussolini did, the upside to a fascist dictator. And he started writing about the big question that socialists had and communists had at the time, which is they thought that after the 1917 revolution in Russia, that the workers of the world would unite and there would be violent revolution all over the world and we would all live in a communist paradise and it would all happen within 5 years. So they thought they had lit a match that would just spread around the world. 10 years went by, nothing happened. And they couldn't figure out why. So they really started looking at it. What Gramsci came up with is it will inevitably happen, but the problem with, bringing about the communist paradise, socialist paradise, is that it's all these darn institutions that get in the way. And so what we need is, and he borrowed a phrase from Mao, or Mao borrowed it from him, depending on the timeline I believe, what we need is a long march to the institutions. We have to destroy these institutions first, and only then can we have and I'm not, by the way, this is almost direct quotes. I'm not making up a narrative for him. This is very explicitly said in his writings. And he was probably the leading leftist thinker of his day. So the Gramsci papers, the prison letters they call them, would be incredibly influential. So that's what started, this long march to the institution. Well, what were those institutions he cited? Okay, gender identity, sexuality, the family unit, traditional mother and father roles, civic organizations. He specifically cited scouting in Great Britain and the U.S., churches, all right, that have to be torn down, government institutions, obviously, and that only when we break those things down, then and only then can we bring to this concept of a man outside of the new man, like the new transcendent man, to transcend all of human history and bring about, we will all just, work hard and give all our stuff to others when they're hungry and everybody will live in peace. And so the Frankfurt School picked that up, and that was brought to the United States by the Frankfurt Schoolers, brought to the University of Chicago specifically. It was taught this is not some kind of conspiracy thing. This is just the factual record. So it was taught by uh, Marcuse. Hubert Marcuse was a Frankfurt schooler, brought that ideology to the United States. Two of his students, and again, I think these guys, there's some hugely redeeming qualities about both of them, but I'm just stating the factual record. Two of his students one of them was a 17-year-old Hillary Clinton, another one was Barack Obama. All right, so they brought this ideology in, and this is very deep, that these institutions have to be destroyed for the benefit of mankind so that we can all move forward into transcend human history into a better world on it. And I'm not saying they set out to do that. I'm just citing the record that they went from Gramsci to the Frankfurt School to Marcuse to all of his students, Belair's and the rest of them. And that's where SDS and all the radical fringe of the 60s went into and adopted the Marcuse vision. And we're seeing that play out now. And so fundamentally, if you believe human institutions are beneficial, obviously there's a good and bad to all of them. If you think those structures are necessary and good to make us live in safety and build economics and have safe families and have human flourishment, then fine. If you believe they are evil, then you think you are doing righteousness when you tear them down. And the thing to keep in mind when we watch these, the transgender for Hamas, which is sort of an interesting organization. I'm not sure they're fully informed about Hamas, but I think we could do a GoFundMe for one-way tickets to Rafah, so they could find out. But
Hamas. Okay.
Oh yeah. It'll be but don't waste your money on a round trip. Just do the one-way ticket on it. When you do that, they are, most of them are sincerely convinced that they are helping humanity move forward. Now, I think they're just wrong, but their sincerity is very real. Like they authentically, 2 days ago, believe a bunch of environmental protesters thinking that they're going to help save the planet, ran out and spray painted Stonehenge. Now, what that has to do with anything, I'm not real sure. But they really sincerely believe, crazy as this may sound, so their worldview sounds as crazy to us, but we have to understand our worldview sounds crazy to them equally. And they really sincerely believe that they're acting virtuously.
I think that a lot of them are delusional. I think a lot of them have just been, honestly, you use the word brainwashed, but that's kind of what has happened. Because one of the things about human institutions, and I can see why they're trying to, or have been trying to destruct them for so long, is human institutions embody tradition. And ultimately what tradition is are lessons learned from the past so that we don't repeat the same mistakes in the future. So whether your outlook is like you're an you're a Darwinian evolutionist, or you happen to have a young Earth creation viewpoint on the world, doesn't really matter. You understand that like 6,000 years ago, if you did this, you were going to die. So you learn, hey, let's not do this anymore. So that becomes tradition. And by rejecting tradition, it's a form of suicide. It really is. And that's why you would have to, I get it. They look at us the same way. Like, you guys, I can't believe you would think this, but you watch them live their lives and you realize that you are actively committing suicide. When you are a child and accepting puberty blockers, you are committing a type of self-death. Like, you're changing the mutable nature or the immutable nature of your body, and you're trying to alter it through unnatural means, which aren't going to work. The fact that you have to, like as a male converting to a female, have to continue taking antibiotics so that the wound in your groin doesn't close back up, that is not natural, nor is it healthy, nor is it creating life. Like, it doesn't create life. It can't. There's no womb there. So all of this kind of stuff is just like, it's just so mind-boggling, but that also shows why and how they've just done such a good job of educating. And it really is. It's this long march of education towards the destruction of the status quo of traditions. And, it's why...
Well, again, but again, if you go back up that syllogistic tree, and like where we part is you and I, innate, we accept that human nature is universal, it's the same throughout the world, and it's also unchanging, so it's the same throughout history. Well, if you start with that, you study traditions, very hard because these traditions are models. They're gates and fences put up in recognition of human nature and really understanding of human nature and what it takes to build a community. If, on the other hand, you believe that human nature is not universal, that me and a couple of my members of my little club have transcended all the rest of you dumb apes, and we are certainly far transcendent of every generation that lives before us, then not only do you not honor traditions, you have contempt for traditions. And you split off and make up your own, and you end up joining transgenders for Palestine, for Gaza, or for Hamas. So, kind of seems odd to me, but you end up there.
I didn't plan on asking this question, but do you think that's part of the reason that the school of Darwinian evolution has been pushed so hard for the past 160 years? Because if you can foist upon a population the belief that you are changing from one species to another, so the transgression of speciations makes it so that a person can eventually believe that I am actually a superior being to another Homo sapien.
Yeah. Well, that was the premise of the whole eugenics movement, right? Which led to Nazism and a lot of other things. So this idea that if genetics is what, and this came along, is downstream from Darwin, from Origin of the Species, but it also came with, the late 19th century discoveries about genetics and what we came to call, later on, we called it DNA, inheritable traits. And the Brits kind of went crazy. Basically, all of our dog breeds didn't exist 150 years ago. The Brits just kind of made up dog breeds, and so they were really into this stuff in terms of dogs, right?
And they're like, yeah,
so
this is Shih Tzu.
Yeah, exactly. They named it for what it looked like, right? But they really, at the time, the current state of the art, and this also creates a lesson of humility about our scientific understanding of any age. At the time, the latest breaking scientific understanding was from Freud, was from the downstream adherents of Darwinism, and the most recent, in the last preceding 2 decades, understanding of genetics. So the thinking was, well, if human nature and human progress is dependent on the DNA of a population, then to improve the population, we should start sterilizing the bottom 10%. And that was a point of view adhered not by a bunch of extremist wackos, but by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a case in writing. And the specific quote is something to the effect of, 4 generations of dumb bastards is enough. Just like so he supported the forced sterilization of this woman who had low IQ. Okay, one of the other adherents of that was Margaret Sanger, and her thesis as a eugenicist. And I grew up in the civil rights era in the South and whatever, so this is as abhorrent to me as it sounds, as it should be to everyone. Well, one of her core theses was black people are of basically a lower primate subspecies, and she referred to black people as human weeds. And if you want to have a healthy garden, you got to trim the weeds. Wow. So she started a nonprofit called the Negro Project. And later they changed their name to Planned Parenthood. So here we are. Wow. And today, 78% of all the marketing of Planned Parenthood does is to young black women, and 78% of the abortions that they render are delivered to young black women. And that's where we are. But there's a worldview that, at its origin, that drives all this. This stuff doesn't just pop up on its own. We have 2 competing worldviews. And for their time, it was a very stylish notion in the early 20th century, the first 20 years. I mean, Hitler didn't come out of nowhere. Nazism was, and the idea of a master race, there were different variations of that the Nazis met in Madison Square Gardens in the 30s, right, in New York City. And it was a booming, giant celebration of Nazism. Like, we're not exempt from any of this. And there were, in the racist South that I grew up in, that had not explicitly, but the implications of that worldview had permeated into this like really structural core racism between it. And the amazing part is the progress we've made from that, because that sounds like the type of ideology that once it gets into a society's thinking, it's just impossible to get out. It's very possible to get out. We got it out. We did that, you know. So this can be unraveled, and that's the message that I think more people need to hear. Like, none of this is inevitable. We get to choose whether to accept this. We get to choose whether to bounce around the world obnoxiously like the new Roman Empire and hold a gun to everybody's head and have them resent us like heck. We can choose not to do that, and I think we're going to.
So what are you seeing that has you believing that we're going to choose to not continue to do that, and some of the other things that you've mentioned that give you hope that a lot of the things that we're seeing that are so concerning to many are we're going to essentially be able to reverse that?
Well, we've got some near to medium term bumps, right? Challenges. And I mean medium term, 5 to 10 year kind of stuff. So one is the 50-year-old petrodollar deal that King Fahd struck with Henry Kissinger in 1972 has now been officially rejected by the Saudis. Our ability to, this year, the U.S. government debt, federal government debt, will be $1.9 trillion. That's what it's projected at, which means it'll probably be way over 2. Our ability to print and sell bonds to people around the world to fund the gap between our spending and our income tax is premised on being able to force them to buy U.S. treasuries so that they can use those treasuries to buy oil. That all goes back to this petrodollar deal in 1972 saying the Saudis, the Middle East, will only accept U.S. dollars in payment for oil, period. And that's that's given us the ability to basically run the printing presses and just make up debt. It's like an unlimited credit card that you never even have to have a minimum payment on. So that's completely over now. That's a very different world. How are we going to fill in a $2 trillion a year gap? And that's $1.9 trillion projected federal deficit in a year in which there's no big economic crisis. We're not in a depression. There's no war. There's no pandemic. There's no real emergency. And yet we are still digging a hole $2 trillion deeper every year. That has to be changed radically on it.
Is that spending
we have a lot of
internal on government functions when it's created at that? Okay.
Yeah. So one of the crazy things, like U.S. government spending now accounts for 44% of the U.S. economy. So unraveling that is going to be very, very difficult. There's going to be all kind of downstream implications of that. A lot of dislocation, relocation in terms of the business community. But we're going to be forced to break our addiction to national debt. And it's going to be like going off heroin. We're going to need a sledgehammer. It's going to be rough. It's not going to hope it's not going to happen all at once. It's going to feel like, it's going to be rough. And we have, paired with that national sovereign debt, we have a record of $16.5 trillion of household debt in the U.S. We have a record $12 trillion of mortgages. We have $1.6 trillion of auto loans. We have $980 billion of credit card debt. 36% of Americans have more credit card debt than they have savings. And this is while mortgages just hit 7.5%. Currently, we're basically fighting inflation with just issuing more debt. And that can work for a while. And like everything, it can't go on forever. And so it won't go on forever. And we're going to break that. The nearest term shocks we're going to have is going to be caused by the central bank's explosion of the rate curve between February of 2020 and 2022. We went from a 0.2 short-term debt to zero risk debt basis to about 2.8%. Okay, that doesn't sound like much, but that is a 14x of your risk-free rate. So what the downstream of that is, I know this is kind of tedious and boring, but I'll get over it. The pain will stop soon. I promise. So Like that means U.S. Treasuries issued today. Those Treasuries that banks and everything bought 2 years ago are now worth about 70% of what they were originally worth, because now rates are 4.8%, not 0.2%. So that means a couple of things. First of all, U.S. Treasuries have lost more in terms of a percentage than stock market lost during the 2008-2009 crash. And we refer to that as a shape-shifting crash. But we've lost more in percentage terms of U.S. Treasuries than we lost then. Banks in the U.S. typically hold U.S. Treasuries as capital reserve to promote safety. The FDIC says U.S. banks has $570 billion of unrealized losses. Some people estimate that at about $1.7 trillion, so it could be much more. Now that, for context, in December, the U.S. banking system reported that their aggregate capital reserve was only $1.1 trillion. So our banking system is basically $500 billion underwater. That's going to have a lot of consequences. So basically, you've probably got 60 to 800 banks that will go out of business. Probably none of the big ones, but most of the small ones are going to have to be seriously reconfigured or changed or go out of business. Commercial real estate is going to be brutal the next 2 years. There's $1.37 trillion of medium-term debt that has to be refinanced. When they financed it in the next 14 months, when they financed it the first time, rates were like 1% or 2%. Now it's going to be 7, 8, or 9%. So the equity in most REITs will probably go to zero. All right. So if you own REITs, like, run, because they're going to have to refinance that debt. It's going to be much higher rates. A lot of insurance companies, capital reserves, and stuff like that are going to be affected. But it's as if the inflationary spending during the COVID era, it was like a boa constrictor eating a baby deer, right? We ate it all at once, but now the boa constrictor is kind of laid out on a rock, and you can see that small deer being slowly digested by the big snake. So it starts out as a big lump, it's getting a little bit smaller. There's nothing we can do to hurry it up. There's nothing we can do to slow it down. There's no government policy or interest rate change or central bank policy that can change that. We're just going to have to absorb that. It'll be a shock, but but the U.S. is so good at getting over stuff like that. Other economies, not so much, but we do pretty great when we have to deal with reality. So we'll get through that. On the other end of it, though, look at the future we're looking at 10 years out, all right? Probably nearer. Like I said earlier, we've effectively eliminated global poverty. That's insane. I mean, that is just almost too good to be believed, but I'd urge you to go look at the data on it. Global GDP, do you guys both remember the year 2010?
I'm not that old.
Oh, yeah.
The global economy today, even as weird as it sounds, we get down on it, the global economy is 50% bigger than it was in 2010.
Wow.
Same number of people just about, but 50% more productivity from the planet Earth. We're looking at a future with total energy independence. We're looking at it is a certainty between renewables, natural gas, nuclear. We're looking at a future in which we can produce limitless energy anywhere on the planet with zero pollution or carbon exfiltration at really close to zero cost. I mean, the marginal cost for energy from some of these systems is almost zero. Big investment up front, amortizes over 50 to 100 years, whatever. And then we're looking at an internet world. I mean, Nate, you said your Starlink went out.
Right.
Okay, Starlink's, just think about the implications of Starlink. Not only have we eliminated poverty, we're about to eliminate all need for funky power, and now we're going to have everybody on the planet, like within months, right? Within the next 2-3 years, everybody on the planet is going to have access to the entire store of all human learning and information in the history of humanity. Like, what a good time to be alive, man. It's good stuff.
Exponential.
There's two things
it's
that you
limitless.
said there that are really interesting. The first being around 90% of people being lifted out of poverty, from 10% of people living or 90% below the poverty line. What was it, 50 years ago? Was that the number? Okay, to 90% above it now. I think one of the things that is going to be a shock to the system, especially for the average American, including myself, is just that the purchasing power that we have will be reduced to the essentials only.
Yep.
I look around me. It's I
Yep.
mean, it's essential for my work in a sense, but like there's a lot of non-essentials here. We, as a culture, spend money on things we don't need all the time. So to have to adjust, it'll be rough. It'll be the same way if you're used to eating nothing but ribeyes all day long, and then all of a sudden it's like, sorry, you're just into iceberg lettuce for the next couple of years. You're not going to be happy about it. Well, you might die there.
No.
The point stands.
No, you're exactly right. But we're going to have to reconfigure our whole. We have to break our addiction to consumerism. So a lot of the U.S. economy is based on just consumerism, which is disposable. It's printing fake money so we can buy cheap junk from China is our current economic model. Sometimes it seems. But your point about like going back to basics reminded me when I started the bond exchange in 1999. The U.S. regulators opened up a new type of license, and so a week later, I applied to become the first bond exchange, and it was an original idea for about 48 hours. By the end of the next week, there were 13 competitors filing for it. By the end of that year, there were 92 companies with the same, as usual, the inspiration of the value of the entrepreneur's inspired idea is somewhere between 0 and negative 20 million, right? So I looked around, I realized I've never owned a bond, sold it, bought it, investment banked it. I've never seen a bond. I just started a bond exchange. I'm not real sure what a bond is, right, to be honest with you. I'm not sure that's why this seemed like a good idea. I looked around, I'm like, okay, they've got, some of these other companies have massive Wall Street firms. They've got all this capital raised, whatever else. I'm like, what is my competitive advantage? And I really dug deep and okay, who are you? And I've been into this for a while, really understand, what do you do really poorly? What do you not do at all that you should do? And what do you do kind of unusually well? And I've always had the ability to have some level of obsessive focus for an extended period of time. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to use that, and then I'm going to kind of weight train with that and extend it. So, and I always run experiments with myself. So the next day I went to a restaurant supply house, and I bought 50-pound sacks of beans, rice, and coffee. And I put them up on one side of my place I was living, my loft, and then I set up my work table and my chair so I would be staring at them. And I made a commitment to myself that the only fluids or food that would go into my body was from one of those sacks until we had revenue. And so I lived on coffee, beans, and rice for 15 months.
Wow.
It was an adjustment. It was an adjustment. But you get over it. 2 billion people a day live on beans and rice. I've been through all South America. All these beans and rice, they're perfectly healthy. They're happy. They work. It's fine. It's a pretty good balanced meal if you break it down. A little starchy, a little carby. But really simplifying our focus on it, and it really helped me physically and mentally just to really focus on it and build it. And 5 years later, we had not 92 competitors, but we had 2 competitors, Market Access and Trader's Edge, that got sold to Reuters, and Market Access IPO'd, and then I sold my company to, ICE, which also owns the New York Stock Exchange, Euronext Exchange, Singapore Exchange, biggest exchange company in the world and stuff. So clarifying focus, we don't need all this junk. I went through my house when I left Atlanta. We were walking through my house. I'm like, who bought all these lamps? Why do I'm one guy? I have 17 lamps. How much light do I really need in the world? How are these tables and chairs and beds? I'm one guy. I need a tent. I'm fine. So, yeah, we have all this junk in our lives. And I'll tell you an experiment I did before I left Atlanta. I had a little condo that I bought in 2009. I bought a lot of real estate because everything was 90% off. And I actually sold my house. I moved into the condo and decided for 2 months that I would only bring with me 100 objects. And I mean shirt, T-shirt, 2 objects. Belt, that's number 3. Pants, number 4. 100 objects, period. And for 2 months, I had a higher peace of mind and mental clarity and less mental noise I'd ever had in my life. It was wonderful. So not only can we live without consumerism, we'll all be a lot happier with it. I'll tell you another experiment that I think everybody should play on themselves. And again, I'm not preaching anything, just for personal awareness. Everybody has one of these little smartphones, right? Well, the smartphone has two functionalities I would encourage people to investigate. One is you can find somewhere in there where it tracks how many hours and minutes over the previous 7 days you've been staring at that phone. If you see that, write that number down. It'll scare you. Write it down. Then engage the second functionality, which is to grayscale the phone. And go in and say, if you click on a YouTube video, it'll still be in color. But when you're just looking at the screens, there's no colors. It's just various shades of white, gray, and black. No, don't do anything else. Wait a week, go back and check and see what your average daily screen time was. Now, when I lectured at Stanford, I did this with my students, and on average, they gained 2.5 hours a day simply from grayscaling their phones. Like, we're being manipulated, and you can't blame them. They have a profit motive just like you and I do, but we have a duty to ourselves to be aware of our mental focus and our emotional happiness and well-being, and to clarify all that. And if you can, by a simple little twitch, regain 2.5 hours a day, that's almost 1,000 hours a year. My gosh, we have so much excess time we could use to do something, even if it's just watching reruns, man. It's better than TikTok, So this whole concept of consumerism, which was kind of invented by Edward Binet, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and Binet invented basically the idea of public relations. He's considered the father of public relations. He was a master of what some people would call propaganda or influence. And he's the one that he basically built the cigarette industry. He was the one that made it cool for women to smoke cigarettes. He was the one that made the idea of a breakfast cereal instead of eating bacon and eggs or just having coffee. I mean, this guy had major influence, and we've been trapped in that economic bubble as a reactive responding to the marketing to us, and we've got to become more proactive and say, what am I putting into my body? I'm going to make an affirmative choice on that. And when the kids point to a colorful box of cereal when they're sitting in the grocery cart in the grocery store, I'm going to say, no, just no. You can scream all you want, just no. And we'll all be better off. So we can do without 90% of the stuff in our lives we could just burn tomorrow, and you'd never notice it, I promise. Except you'd be more peaceful, you'd have more time every day.
The other thing that I was going to say that came out of what you had talked about is the new forms of energy that we're going to have are also going to be producing simultaneous to the newer forms of AI that are coming along. And I think that is a marriage that, sure, it has some dystopian sides that you could possibly explore, and we should obviously be aware of. But I think AI is a huge game changer for humanity. I mean, I really do. I think if you're going to look at it in terms of the kind of output that is demanded of a person in a white-collar job can ultimately be reduced by leveraging AI, which gives them time to enjoy their lives as opposed to having to work 50, 60, 70 hours a week. So I think that's a really cool thing to look forward to as well. I think about that quite a bit, like the amount of effort that people put into their jobs being reduced and still getting the same type of economic value out of it is really a value add it's a net positive for people, provided that they're using their time wisely and, again, not chasing the dollar so that they can have more things, shit that they need or they want that they don't need.
No. So you can buy more cheap disposable stuff from China. Yeah, it's kind of weird. When it kind of seems, when you put it that way, it kind of sounds like total waste of a life on it. The AI thing is fascinating. It's hard to think of math being an area of innovation. Like, we think of math like math is math. Like, what the hell? But when they came out with the tensor algos a couple of years ago, it was a real breakthrough in terms of probability theory. And it was incredibly powerful and meaningful on it. And so everybody had been waiting for this for, my gosh, AI, artificial intelligence has been the next big thing for like 50 years. It's like Dippin' Dots ice cream or Brazil. It's like it's the ice cream of the future. It's just about to happen. It's been just about to happen since about 1954.
Yeah.
But it's finally here. And the main thing so far, I think, to me, is it really challenges us to think about what it really means to be human, and what is thinking. Because a lot of what we consider thinking is really just pattern recognition and pattern assembly and reassembly. Well, AI can do that pretty well. It's really good at recognizing patterns because it's probability based, and you can run the transistor a lot faster than you can run neurons. So we're going to be forced to kind of think of the higher level work now, which is good. We do this every 30 or 50 years. There's a new innovation, machinery in the Industrial Revolution, telecommunications in the 50s and 60s, the internet. I mean, this is what humans do. We take what had been kind of a bespoke suit. If you wanted a suit in the 1900s, you went to a tailor. He measured you, and you measured 3 or 4 times. Now, you can still do that if you want. It'll cost you $2,000 to $5,000. But most people go down to Brooks Brothers and give them $500 and take in the helm, and you're done. And that's kind of taking what is initially a bespoke product and then commoditizing it into a mass, slightly, alterable or customizable product. That's kind of the whole value creation, value chain. That's what we all do with businesses. We take something that used to require professional, $500 an hour advice, and then we commoditize it so somebody can go and build their own website in 15 minutes and you're just done. And so this idea of the difference this time is it's not just speed, but it's the pattern recognition. And that's sort of crazy. It will eat up insane amounts of energy. And I think one of the things that it will absolutely destroy is, because it's so alluring, is the whole deceleration movement will be absolutely obliterated by this thing. Because there's been a deceleration movement since about the late 1940s. And their whole premise is, since we're all about to run out of stuff, we need to dial back the global economy. Everybody needs to be given 5 acres of land, farm your own food. We need to stop all this industrialization. I get it, but it's I think they're romanticizing what farm life in the 17th century really was. Like, if you actually read about what that was like,
No.
I don't want to go back there. Like, that does not look like fun. So that whole idea of dialing down economic growth and reconciling it that way will just be obliterated, because this thing eats up so much power. And we're going to want it, and we're going to be willing to do whatever it takes to do the power. It's been interesting the last 5 years or so, the U.S. population, the polls and stuff, have completely flipped about nuclear power. And even more interesting, I'm not sure I understand this, but it really breaks down on gender too. So men have flipped tremendously into a massive support of nuclear power. Women have changed a little bit, but they're not sure yet. But the trends are getting in that way. So what had been, since they filmed that Jane Fonda movie, The China Syndrome, where it got burned in everybody's mind that nuclear power is insanely dangerous, it can destroy the world and all this. And that has completely been reversed. And now we're looking at the Gen 3, the Gen 4 plants. We can make them safely. We can store nuclear waste safely. We've done it for 50 years now. We know how to do that. And we could design new reactor designs that are even more safe than we'd ever even contemplated. So that's incredibly encouraging. If you can give a population energy, everything else works out.
Yeah.
If you can get limitless, if you can get low-cost energy, zero pollution energy, then you can use it for water desalination, which means you can go into deserts and make them into, farmland. We can reclaim for productivity large amounts of the world that right now are just economically not feasible to support people. So yeah, I'm incredibly fired up about it.
Have you watched the documentary The Lost Century?
No.
It's a pretty good one. It's the one that they get into a lot of the the Nikola Tesla stuff.
Mm.
Like pulling energy out of the air and how that's actually, so the problem, I guess what I'm getting at is that the problem isn't the technology. The technology is actually out there to solve a lot of these problems, but for whatever reason, it's not being deployed.
Yeah, it's being blocked by some kind of junky institutions, like a lot of things are being junked out. So it's not all down. It's not just downsides when our institutions lose credibility. If the institutions are in fact corrupt, right, then they should lose credibility. And, the whole AC/DC debate between him and Westinghouse and Edison, it went a weird way. And here we are 100 years later, still using AC. Whereas, so there's a lot of things. Now, everything Tesla says he invented, some of it sounds sort of wacky. Mm-hmm. Like I don't know. I mean,
right.
but who am I? Like I barely got out of physics in the 11th grade. That's my qualification to have an opinion. But there's a lot out there,
right?
And we have to have some humility and really appreciate. Like when we look go back and when people need to go back and study financial panics and public panics about resources. We have seen this movie. This is like Friday the 13th, part 28. I can tell you how it ends.
Right.
All right. I don't know about the first hour and a half, but those last 5 minutes, I can tell you right now. And it ends up with a panic. And then, we come to a wall. We panic because our path is unsustainable. And that's true. Our path is unsustainable. And we think we're going to go off a cliff. And instead we find a new path. And we do it every single time. And so it's the most reliable bet in the universe, weirdly as is, the most reliable bet is that human innovation will always find a new path to accomplish what we want every single time. We've never missed that.
I hate to do this.
Batting 1,000, like you said.
I hate to do this, but I got to jump onto another call in about 3 minutes, but that was a perfect spot to end.
Great.
Yeah, we did circle it back.
Yeah, and I really want to. I think we should do this again. Don't take the headset back yet, because that was a fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think we'll let John hold on to that. I would love to do another one too, where we dig into some of the stuff that John's actually been actively working on, because it's really fascinating. We can talk about Abe and some of those things. So we're gonna have to have John back on
sometime in July, first or second or third week, if you're up for it, John.
Yeah, I'll probably.
Okay.
Well, I'll have my own headset by then, because I definitely like this headset. I'm going to order it. Thanks for it. So wherever I am in the world, I'd be glad to. I'm probably going to be overseas, but I'd be glad to. Appreciate it. It's been fun.
Yeah,
it's been really interesting conversation.
John, if people want to follow you or check out more of what you are doing right now, like where would be the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, I don't do. I'm a consumer of social media. I'm not active in it at all. My company's website is abe.io, which stands both for Abe Lincoln, Honest Abe, but also for a better exchange. What we're building is a single global stock exchange and bond exchange where a company can come one time, register their IPO, and then IPO and trade with 3 billion investors around the world that collectively have about 80% of the world's financial resources. So we're going to be launching that later this year. And it's built largely using blockchain technology, but it operates in a small subset of the crypto community that I like to call NFC, which is non-felonious crypto. Okay. So this is the very compliant, like antiseptically compliant version. Like all I do is deal with regulators all day long. So this is like very traditional stocks, bonds, futures, contracts, stuff like that. But we'll come up for it's. We're still kind of in stealth mode, but we'll be coming up publicly in the fall. Anyway, that's what we've been working on.
That's awesome. It is, and I want to dig into it more.
Well, thank
it's
you
been
very
fun,
much,
man.
John.
Well, John,
awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your time, guys. It's good to meet you, Adam. Good to see you, Nick.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Adam.